program. I'm Marcy Winograd, coordinator of Code Pink Congress, and I am so proud to be here with my co-hosts, Medea Benjamin and Nicole Harrison and Marielena Krukalos of Peace Action, as well as others from Peace Action. We'll be hearing from them in a minute. I just thought I'd review the agenda first, and then we'll hear from the other co-hosts. So our agenda tonight is we have terrific speakers lined up. Dr. Gerald Horne, I'm sure many of you have heard him speak before, fabulous speaker, prolific author, professor of African-American history, labor history, diplomatic history. I'd like to learn that. At the University of Houston, he has written extensively, as I said, more than 30 books, from Haiti's Black Jacobins to imperialism in Northeast Africa and so forth. But we'll give him more of an introduction in a minute. First, I also want to say that our second speaker is Walden Bello, a vice presidential candidate in the Philippines, journalist, environmentalist, human rights champion. And we will have a Q&A with them after we hear from them, 8 to 10 minutes. And then we will take an action. Massachusetts Peace Action, our co-sponsor tonight, will be leading us in that action, which is basically to urge our members of Congress to back Biden on a no-fly. We do not want a no-fly zone, rejection of a no-fly zone. Rather than closing the skies, it opens the skies and could usher in World War III. We'll talk more about that later, but first, let's go to Cole. Cole, perhaps you'd like to give us an update on what's going on with Massachusetts Peace Action.
Thank you, Marcy. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. The Russia-Ukraine war is in its third week. It's intensifying, and it's riveting the attention of everybody in the world. Our perspective on the war is we condemn the Russian invasion, we demand troops out, we demand a ceasefire, but we also recognize the many actions the United States and NATO have taken to lead us up to the current situation. We oppose U.S. arms to Ukraine, we oppose U.S. troops, we oppose the draconian sanctions on Russia, which are going to hurt ordinary people. We think all these will further inflame the situation, and above all, we oppose the establishment of a no-fly zone, which is currently the debate in Washington. So those are our thoughts. I want to throw to this group informally that it's time to get out on the streets once again about the no-fly zone. We have a Peace in Ukraine international coalition, but it hasn't come out with any steps for a couple of weeks, and maybe this is the week we should be out on the streets. And again, I'll just put that thought out for everyone.
Thank you, Cole. Your statement sounds very familiar. Code Pink put out a similar statement. Medea is with us tonight. Yes, she worked on that statement as well.
We borrowed many of your points from it.
Okay, a few updates on what's happening in terms of Ukraine. Many of you have probably read the news that Zelensky has said that Ukraine will remain neutral and not join NATO. So that's a hopeful diplomatic sign. There's a lot going on. I'm sure our guests will discuss. The U.S. sent a high-level delegation to Venezuela to talk about perhaps lifting the sanctions to ensure that we receive some of Venezuela's oil. That was not greeted with open arms by Senator Bob Menendez, who chairs a powerful committee in the Senate. So stay tuned on that. China, there are reports that Russia is asking for China's help. China publicly has said we need to de-escalate. A lot of us are saying that. What else is going on? Well, the situation in eastern Ukraine, Mariupol, is dire. We know that. Now, CNN is reporting over 3 million Ukrainians have fled as refugees to other parts of Europe, Poland, Romania, Slovakia. Some of them, though, however, are returning to their homes. What else? Okay, let's hear from others. Marielena Krukalos, you're co-hosting with us tonight from Massachusetts Peace Action. You're on the board of Massachusetts Peace Action. Great to have you with us tonight.
Thanks so much, Marcy. It's really great to be with everybody on a really difficult time during difficult times. I mean, the point is that the world is awash in war. I know that this attack surprised all of us, many of us, but in fact, on the same day of the invasion, Yemen was hit by 37 separate airstrikes across that country. And as we opposed the fly zone and call for Russian troops out of the war and no to NATO, we must similarly demand Biden to stop US complicity in the greatest humanitarian disaster in the world, where in Yemen, at least 377,000 folks by the end of 2021 have perished. And the US is a direct participant in this violence. Additionally, the US resumed its bombing campaign against Somalia, Africa's second poorest nation, and Israel continues to escalate its attacks in Syria. I haven't even begun to talk about Afghanistan. That's on the verge of a famine. It threatens to be an even worse humanitarian disaster than Yemen. And similarly, the Biden administration must release the funds that belong to Afghanistan. This is really a moment for the peace movement to up its game. The weapons manufacturers are driving this gleefully forward with their stock prices soaring, and in fact, diverting our attentions from the other existential crisis, which is the climate crisis. So I couldn't be happier to be with you all today.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, for that update. Medea, you've been involved with Afghanistan and demands that we turn over the money that we stole in the night. Anything you'd like to add on Afghanistan?
Well, we're actually putting together a women's delegation that will be going to Afghanistan quite soon to directly learn more about what's happening with the economy and the central bank, to witness the opening of girls' schools there. So we can report back to you in the next Code Pink Congress. One other thing about Ukraine I wanted to add is that if there are any people in the DC area that are early risers, we are going to be outside of Congress tomorrow morning when Zelensky is addressing a joint session of Congress. And we know that he'll be asking for a no-fly zone, more weapons, warplanes, and we'll be there with our messaging of saying, reject no-fly zone negotiations, not escalation. So anybody around, meet us at the Capitol steps tomorrow morning. We'll be there from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m.
Thank you for organizing that, Medea. Yes, I imagine there will be a lot of pressure tomorrow when Zelensky addresses Congress and asks for a no-fly zone. We've seen a bipartisan position. No, we reject this. We know this could be the beginning of World War III and a nuclear war. It's so frightening. Yet, Reuters is reporting that 70 to 80% of the US public supports a no-fly zone. I think a lot of people are confused. They don't understand what this means, the ramifications, right? So it's our responsibility to educate, but also to urge our members of Congress to educate. So we'll take action on that tonight. Please stay with us for that action and also amplify it and urge your friends on social media to do so as well. At this point, I'd like to introduce Elizaveta Kuprianova. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She is Russian. She's an intern with Massachusetts Peace Action, and she's here to offer her thoughts. Elizaveta.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, Russian invasion has been lasting already for over 2 weeks, and the consequences that we're facing already are devastating. There have been a lot of human lives lost, both civilians and from the army side. Russia became one of the most sanctioned countries. And some of you probably already heard me on the previous coping event saying, but the consequences of, like, even if the war ends tomorrow, the consequences will take decades and decades to resolve, and generation after generation will take time to normalize the relationship between countries from Russian side, normalize the infrastructure, the life in Ukraine in general, and the relationship. And I am also very happy to be in the United States and be able to speak as a Russian citizen person, because it's devastating to see how Russian people are being censored and unable to speak and stand against war. And I think that we should be we need diplomacy right now more than ever, and keep on pushing for it, especially right now, because we're in a very thin line where like the world can face the biggest and unimaginable disaster in humanity.
Thank you. We feel the same way. We appreciate hearing from you, Elizabeth. I was really uplifted. I attended a rally, a peace rally. Well, it started out as a peace rally in Santa Barbara on Chumash land, where I am. And I met up with 3 students from the University of California at Santa Barbara. One was from Kiev, Ukraine. One was from Moscow, Russia. And one was from Minsk, Belarus, where my grandfather was born. And they had all come to support diplomacy, not war, not more weapons, not a no-fly zone, none of that. So
I'm happy that like citizens from those countries have this opportunity to support.
yes. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Medea to introduce our first guest.
Well, I'm delighted to introduce Gerald Horne. He is just a brilliant history professor at the University of Houston and author of so many books, over 30 books, and the range of them is quite mind-boggling, from Haiti's Black Jacobins to imperialism in Northeast Africa, the globalization of the African-American freedom struggle. He's also written extensively about the film industry, about the music industry. He teaches courses on U.S. history through film. He received his Ph.D. in history from Columbia University, his J.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, and his B.A. from Princeton University. So we are absolutely delighted and honored that you could join us tonight, Gerald, and give us, I know you've got, I've listened to you on this subject and your range of knowledge is incredible, but unfortunately, you've only got about 8 to 10 minutes tonight. So thank you so much for joining us.
Before you jump in, Gerald, Dr. Horne, I'm going to say, take the time that you want. You've got the time.
Okay. Well, I only prepared. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here this evening. And I have little time, but many points. I was told 8 to 10 minutes, so that's what I prepared for, although I can improvise if need be. And I refer you to the summary of my views in the blackagendareport.com and at the analysis.news. And my task is to address the global implications of this crisis in Eastern Europe. First, the Ukraine crisis will have profound impact on food prices, especially wheat and bread, and secondly, fertilizer, given the fact that those commodities emerge from Russia and Ukraine. Much of the exports of these commodities goes to North Africa and West Asia, which could then lead to skyrocketing food prices, perhaps famine, inducing migration flows across the Mediterranean to the European Union. In the past, this has instigated popularity for right-wing populists and neo-fascist politicians, particularly in Italy. Obviously, ongoing supply chain problems, especially log jams at ports, for example, Long Beach, Los Angeles, will exacerbate this trend. Of course, this food insecurity will not leave the United States unaffected, as evidenced by the fact that millions exist on food stamps. Secondly, there will be impact on energy prices. Already one sees the Biden administration overtures to Venezuela. According to press reports, this was due not only because of petroleum, but the interest in the release of, quote, hostages, unquote, and, quote, security, unquote, matters, insofar as Caracas is close to Moscow and Beijing. If the latter factor concerning security is accurate, this could lead to overtures to Havana and Managua too, but note the South Florida Cuban-American right-wing community, along with Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey, have railed against these overtures to Caracas, which may dampen White House initiatives. The press reports that the US president is headed to Saudi Arabia for similar reasons of energy, and this may have given Riyadh more impetus to execute 81 prisoners the other day, and could lead to more aid from the United States to this nation in their ongoing war in Yemen, which too is on the brink of famine. However, the Saudis are fighting forces thought to be close to Iran in Yemen. In that light, I note that talks between Riyadh and Tehran have been suspended recently, As well, the talks in Vienna concerning resumption of the 2015 nuclear accord with Iran have been stymied since Russia wants assurance that it can conduct business with Tehran without sanctions. I should note in this context the book by the late US strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor under Jimmy Carter, the book The Grand Chessboard, where he warned against a de facto troika of Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran emerging, which he saw as a threat to US hegemony. Speaking of energy, this will have maximum impact on African petroleum producers. In the New York Times recently, analyst Thomas Meany noted that of the 10 most populous nations on planet Earth, only one, the United States, was fully committed to sanctions against Russia. The 9 also likely includes the nation of Nigeria, a major petroleum producer. The African list of energy producers also includes Algeria, which has fraught relations with France, the European Union leader, but will be expected to fill the gap left by boycott of Moscow's natural gas and oil producers. Angola, amongst the 17 or so African nations that abstained on the General Assembly vote castigating Moscow, and Equatorial Guinea are also amongst leading oil producers. The latter regime, speaking of Equatorial Guinea, has incurred the wrath of the United States lately by opening the door to Chinese interests and may be on the list for regime change by Washington sooner rather than later. Interestingly, as suggested a moment ago, a disproportionate number of African nations abstained on the General Assembly vote censoring Russia, including South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Tanzania, Senegal, as did a number of South Asian nations, including Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. This led to a bitter confrontation of late between the European Union and the United States on the one hand, and Islamabad on the other. The Brussels and Washington were quite upset by Pakistan's position. And of course, it also led to complicated relations with Bangladesh, with the New York Times even reprimanding Denmark for seeking to halt vaccine shipments to Bangladesh in retaliation for their abstention at the General Assembly. Expect these flaps between the global South and the North Atlantic nations to continue, because ultimately they're a reflection of these nations seeking to pursue an independent foreign policy in the wake of the rise of China, more of which anon. In sum, in addition to rising food prices in the United States, expect rising gasoline prices too, a boon to price gougers in Texas in particular. Speaking of energy, there are gaping loopholes in the BDS regime against Russia, BDS being boycott, divestment, and sanctions, a recently inaugurated movement that has gained traction much more rapidly than the BDS movement against Israel. With regard to the point about gaping loopholes, note that the third largest bank in Russia is the bank controlled by the natural gas giant Gazprom, and that bank is not sanctioned, which of course probably means that by the end of the year, it'll be the #1 bank in Russia. Of course, it helps to finance these natural gas exports to places like Germany, while Total of France has not followed its comrades BP, erstwhile British Petroleum, and Exxon in exiting Russia. Speaking of China, perhaps the most significant impact of the Ukraine crisis could well be a further step towards a new global order, with Beijing in the driver's seat. Even the New York Times had a report on the front page this morning suggesting as much. You're probably familiar with the February 4th communique between President Putin and Xi, speaking of a relationship without limits. Certainly with Russian airspace barred to EU airlines, this means that those flying from London or Paris to Tokyo, Shanghai, or Seoul may use an Asian or a Chinese airliner to the detriment of British Airways or KLM or France. Speaking of South Korea, the recent election of President Yoon in Seoul will likely mean his nation becoming at least an ex officio member of the anti-China alliance, speaking of the Quad, meaning US, Australia, Japan, and India. A major question as I speak is whether China will observe sanctions against Russia, especially since these sanctions do not have the imprimatur of the United Nations. This could easily lead to a new standoff between Russia and China versus the North Atlantic Bloc, and reference here the 7-hour meeting yesterday in Rome between US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and a leading member of the political bureau of the Chinese Communist Party, which presumably Sullivan, a senior administration official, described as both, quote, intense, unquote, and candid, quote, unquote. Similarly, the decision by Berlin to spend more on armaments will surely be taken quite seriously in Moscow in light of the history of the 20th century. However, a question to ascertain will be whether this maneuver will be in accord with France's oft-stated preference for Brussels' strategic autonomy, as opposed to being a boon for NATO, which it seems to be at first glance, since Germany said it will be buying F-35 jets from the United States, despite the fact that President Macron of France, who will be facing elections shortly, has described NATO in the past as, quote, brain dead, unquote. In any case, the enhanced militarism will likely lead to a boost in the share price of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, of course, being the former home of Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin, which argues for renewed emphasis on slashing the Pentagon budget and moving the funds to food stamps in light of this looming hunger crisis, deepening of hunger crisis in this country, homelessness, education, and healthcare. This renewed emphasis on the fossil fuel economy, or the fossil fool economy, as some call it, may lead to a boost to the green economy in light of the importance of petroleum in this new constellation of forces. However, the recent defeat of Sarah Bloom Raskin's appointment to the Fed, not least to her concern about climate change, does not bode well for the green economy. Above all, we must prevent this crisis, as a number of speakers before me have already suggested. We must prevent this crisis from devolving into World War III. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horne. At this point, I just want to see if Walden Bello, our next guest, is with us. He was going to join us from the Philippines. If not, we will try to reach out to him, but in the meantime, we can open it up to questions for Dr. Horne. So Cole, Medea, Mary Ellen, myself, we can jump in, ask some questions. And if you would like to ask a question of Dr. Horne in the chat, please do so. I'd like to throw this first question out there, Dr. Horne. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or if anyone does, but, you know, under Bush, I believe Bush was the one who said, oh, we should invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO and expand further into Eastern Europe. And then we saw the coup in 2014 supported by the United States that overthrew a democratically elected leader in Ukraine and installed as part of the transition government a neo-Nazi. We could go on about the events that led up to the invasion. However, I'm wondering, and I've been asked this, what was the one, if there was one, inciting incident? I mean, why now? You know, this has been ongoing, this concern of Russia's about NATO installing anti-ballistic missiles on their border. So why now? Any thoughts on that?
Well, if you look at the State Department website, and I'm surprised this has not gotten more attention, there is a detailed agreement inked November 10th, 2021, between Ukraine and the United States. I can't recall if it's described as a strategic partnership or not, but certainly that's the implication. In that detailed agreement, there is also reference to NATO, not necessarily Ukraine becoming a full-fledged member of NATO, but certainly that issue is bruited in this document. From my point of view, this helped to trigger the intensification of Moscow's pressure on Ukraine with regard to NATO. And as I said, I'm surprised that that particular document has not gotten more attention.
Thank you. Medea, Cole?
Well, Oh, why don't you go ahead, Cole, then I'll go.
Well, I'd like to look at the scenario of a no-fly zone, which has been discussed in Washington and by Zelensky. And apparently many people think that's going to be one of the points that he's going to make in his speech to Congress tomorrow. And is it true that a no-fly zone would precipitate a US-Russia war? Or is there another way to look at that?
I think I'm very pleased and happy to hear the focus thus far on the no-fly zone, because this is one occasion where I agree with President Biden, where he has bluntly suggested that it could lead to World War III. And I do not think that that is an exaggeration at all. A no-fly zone conceivably could lead to dogfights in the air between Russian jets and NATO jets over the Ukrainian landmass, and it could trigger further escalation. In that regard, it was quite disappointing to listen to the Sunday morning chat shows, Face the Nation, Meet the Press, This Week on ABC, where virtually to a person, every host was pressing administration spokespersons and others with regard to initiating a no-fly zone, with little acknowledgement of the dire consequences that could ensue. Like yourselves, I fully expect this to be raised tomorrow with Mr. Zelensky's, President Zelensky's speech to the US people and I guess to Congress as well. And I salute, as ever, Medea Benjamin for having the gumption and the energy to go out tomorrow to protest this possibility, which is likely a probability, because it seems a la World War I, and excuse me for sounding alarmist, that there's a kind of sleepwalking into a heightened conflict. A lot of this has to do with the arrogance, I'm afraid to say, in US circles in Washington. Some of it has to do with the apparent underestimation of Russia, which you can easily glean not only since February 24th, but obviously before February 24th. But for whatever reason, I think that that is a quite dangerous era. And I'm happy to see that Mass Peace Action and Code Pink are on top of this matter.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. I have a question about Africa. Where are the leaders in Africa on what's going on? Have they been speaking out? And
yes.
Can I add to that? Can I add to that, Gerald? Which is, where's the street in Africa?
That's another question.
Yeah. How are people feeling about this? And what is the news that they're getting?
Well, first of all, it's complicated. If you look at the General Assembly vote, as noted, there were about 36 nations that abstained. 17 were from Africa. One voting against was, of course, Eritrea. The 17, I think I mentioned, included such stalwarts as South Africa, Tanzania, Namibia, Senegal, etc. President Ramaphosa of South Africa, which is tied to Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and the so-called BRICS, has offered his good offices as a mediator. Of course, he was the point man when the apartheid leaders were negotiated out of power, leading to the first democratic elections of 1994. I was surprised that in the New York Times just a few days ago, that reference was made to the second most populous nation on the African continent, speaking of Ethiopia, which I don't think registered a vote with regard to the censure motion in the General Assembly. But the New York Times mentioned something that I think speaks to a wider, larger question, which is that during the time when then Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, was seeking to repel Italian colonizers in the 1890s, there were Russian volunteers on the ground. not to mention the fact that Russia had armed the Abyssinians. Now, this has to do with a longer history, whereby when the Western European nations were getting fat on the plunder and pillage of Africa and the Americas, Russia, of course, was moving east, oftentimes at the expense of Central Asia and ultimately China. And Russia, therefore, had complicated relations with the Western European nations going back to Napoleon's invasion 200 plus years ago. And so Russia, oftentimes, even Tsarist Russia, was seeking to support Africans fending off colonialism, which was a tendency inherited by the then Soviet Union, which armed the liberation fighters in South Africa, in Namibia, in Mozambique, which also abstained. And I think that that legacy helps to explain those abstentions. And also what helps to explain the abstentions is there was a lot of upset in Africa about how African students were treated on the Ukraine-Polish border, which of course too was reported once again in the New York Times this morning. And the African Union issued a statement criticizing it. President Buhari of Nigeria, the giant of the continent, issued a statement. There had been thousands of African students matriculating there. And I would also say that it's had a very powerful influence on African American opinion as well, these stories of maltreatment and mistreatment. And that's something that you may want to take into account in terms of your future actions.
Thank you. Dr. Horne, I have a question. Dare I go here? But Donald Trump, for all the talk about Russiagate and Donald Trump, when you look at his record, he walked away from 2 arms limitation treaties with Russia and was about to walk away from the START treaty when his term ended. Additionally, it was under Trump that the United States, unlike under Obama, started arming Ukraine, which may have provided another provocation for Russia, not to excuse anything that Russia has done, but I'm just pointing that out. So what do you think? If Trump were president, would we be facing this? Would we already be engaged in World War III? How do you think this will impact any ascendancy on the part of Republicans in the United States?
Well, it's difficult to speculate on how Trump might have conducted himself. Although will say this, I think historians of the future, assuming that humanity survives, will look back at this period with wonder and perhaps bafflement, because at least since Obama, there has been all of this rhetoric and talk about a pivot towards Asia, which means a pivot towards China. That's the import of the Quad, which I already made reference to. And yet, once again, we see the United States bogged down in Eastern Europe, face to face in a confrontation with Moscow. And as suggested, to the extent that Washington is bogged down in Eastern Europe, it seems to me that hampers its ability to go after what they consider to be the big enchilada, which is China. And of course, Mr. Trump himself did not deviate from this Obama line. In fact, I oftentimes thought he was pursuing a Kissinger type approach. Recall how Kissinger leaned towards China, and that, of course, in some sense helped to create the present crisis insofar as the payoff to China was massive direct foreign investment, which has created this juggernaut. And of course, it ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I assume, perhaps I was giving Mr. Trump too much credit, that he wanted to lean towards Moscow in order to better focus on China. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but certainly, whatever the case in terms of our speculative ruminations, the fact is that we're in the middle of a dire crisis. And once again, I salute Mass Action and Code Pink for taking it on.
Thank you. Cole?
Well, so what about the economic situation? Assuming we survive for another few months, the mainstream press is crowing that the draconian sanctions on Russia, more severe than in any other situation, are soon going to bring the Russian economy to its knees. Is this true?
That may happen, but Also, I think that it could drive Russia and China closer together. Obviously, their economies are complementary insofar as the natural gas and oil that may not be going westward could easily go eastward. Certainly, China has a use for the titanium, which is essential to building aircraft that will no longer presumably be going to Boeing. I noticed that Airbus, the European competitor, has not said that it will give up Russian titanium. I think those who fly airplanes probably should be happy that Boeing may not be building more planes anytime soon, given their recent record of disaster. But in any case, I think that one scenario could be a Great Depression in Russia, the likes of which we have not seen to this point. However, given the fact that excuse the expression, the number 2 economy with a bullet, speaking of China, is going to presumably be coming to their assistance, and given the fact that India, which has a relationship to Russia going back at least to Indian independence in 1947, with New Delhi just announcing that any spare energy that Russia is not able to sell westward, New Delhi would be happy to take that petroleum off the hands of Russia. So I think that once again, the mainstream commentators are much too much involved in cheerleading instead of analysis. And to that extent, I think that they're doing a disservice to their readers who need analysis more than cheerleading.
Thank you. Medea, jump in if you have a question.
Yes. We haven't addressed the sanctions yet, right?
Only in passing.
So I want to ask you about the sanctions, and there's a very interesting question in the comments, because normally we would ask you about sanctions and the negative impact it will have on the Russian people, and you talked about the wheat prices and how that will affect the Middle East and other places. But somebody did ask in the chat whether sanctions has a silver lining in that they stimulate new programs of development when trade is not possible. Do you see this trend emerging for Russia and its allies, disadvantaging the US and its allies?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I just read a piece recently about Iran, which of course has been surpassed by Russia as being the most sanctioned nation. And apparently in Iran, there has been considerable so-called import substitution. That is to say, this nation of 83 million has been forced to develop certain indigenous industries with regard to clothing and other necessities. And that's an example of, I assume, what you're discussing. With regard to sanctions, I know that there is an idea out that's floating around, and of course there's a new book on sanctions that folks may want to look at by Nick Mulder, M-U-L-D-E-R. But commonly it's thought that sanctions are not necessarily the kind of regime change element that they are thought to be. Certainly Iran is evidence for that because, well, at least thus far, it has not led to regime change in Tehran. But at the same time, I don't think that that should lead us to denigrate sanctions, because being familiar with Zimbabwe, for example, where I once resided, there's little doubt that sanctioning Harare over 2 decades ago helped to weaken the economy, and it led directly to a palace coup against then leader Robert Mugabe. And I assume that that is the thinking in Washington, that if you make the Russian economy scream, to use the phrase that Kissinger and Nixon used against Allende's Chile some decades ago, that there will be some sort of mass uprising in Russia that will topple President Putin. And of course, there's always what Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, suggested, which is an assassination plot against President Putin, the old reliable and the dirty tricks of Washington. But in any case, this sanctions regime is very serious. And certainly, I think that Washington may, as some analysts have suggested, may be hurting itself, because to the extent that China benefits from this present crisis, we already saw the news today, I'm sure, that in the talks between China and Saudi Arabia, there's discussion of using the Chinese currency as opposed to the dollar with regard to trading of oil into China. And there is an apprehension in certain circles that Washington may be undermining the dollar in the long run with this sanctions happy regime, sanctions against Zimbabwe, Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, et cetera. It's almost as if they're trying to develop this block of nations which will seek to escape the extraterritorial jurisdiction of Washington, ultimately to the detriment of the dollar.
Good point. Dr. Horne, NATO. Okay, we have a lot of people on the left in this chat throughout the country saying this invasion was provoked by NATO. Much of the blame lays at the doorstep of the United States, which dominates NATO and NATO. That NATO is an arms cartel, that it should be disbanded. Then you have, I read the Washington Post, I read the comments, and you have a lot of people saying, "Oh, yeah, NATO is the only thing stopping Putin from taking over all of Europe," right? But at the same time, the justified reluctance of NATO to get involved with a confrontation, a direct confrontation with Russia that possesses 6,000 nuclear weapons, more weapons than any other nation, underscores that NATO really doesn't want a head-on confrontation. So then what is the point of NATO? I mean, it is a little dizzying, don't you think?
Well, it's interesting. Before this current crisis, I just thought that NATO was a hustle, basically. By hustle, excuse the colloquialism, for those who may not be familiar with US verbiage, I thought that it was this sort of scheme whereby you get these small nations like Montenegro and North Macedonia and other former members of the Warsaw Pact to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And then under the concept of interoperability, they have to then spend more on weaponry, which basically means that they go hat in hand, or I should say, a sack of money in hand to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon to buy weapons that then presumably will never be used. So that was the hustle. It's just a way to drive up the share price of these charter members of the military-industrial complex. Now, obviously, I have to do a rethink in light of the current crisis, but I do think that part of the demand that we should be putting forward, and I know that you have put forward, is really NATO needs to go out of business. I mean, it should have gone out of business in 1991. After all, it came into existence in 1949 as an explicitly anti-Soviet alliance. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. One would have thought that NATO would have gone out of business in 1991, but instead we see it involved in Afghanistan. We see it involved in exceeding the UN mandate towards regime change in Libya. We see it, despite some of the comments by the mainstream press, involved in a war in Europe, in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, whereby you had this sign of things to come when US fighter jets bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which was a punch in the nose to a rising China, was quite dangerous. And fortunately, China reacted with restraint. But in any case, NATO has outlived its usefulness. to speak of it as a defensive alliance, as Mr. Stoltenberg, the leader, often does, barely passes the giggle test in light of its bellicosity in North Africa, in Afghanistan, the former Yugoslavia, et cetera. And I think that at least informally, if we are in a conversation with those close to ruling circles in France, for example, we should encourage President Macron's tendency to see NATO as brain dead. And if it is brain dead, which is the term that he used, we should put NATO out of its misery. We should pull the plug and let it drift off into eternity.
Thank you. I think Medea has one last question, and or Cole may have a question as well, and then we want to get to the action too.
Well, just one to comment on what you just said, Gerald. I think, unfortunately, this has strengthened NATO, given it a purpose. As you said in your opening remarks, the NATO countries are now adding so much money to their budgets. They're fulfilling the goal of 2% of their gross domestic product spent on the military. And, I think thanks to Putin, NATO now has a new lease on life. But that leads me to my question, which is how to talk about Putin. It's very hard as progressives to find the right tone, the right sense. I mean, if we can agree that this invasion is catastrophic, but yet we don't want to be falling into the whole Russophobia and personalizing this so much, how do you talk about Putin?
It's very difficult. I was being grilled this morning, in fact, on KPFA, the Pacifica station in Berkeley, about this same point. And it's a difficult tightrope to walk because, as I said to the person that was interrogating me, if the Kremlin had emailed me or called me to seek advice before February 24th, I would have counseled them not to intervene in Ukraine, because I don't think one needs a crystal ball or to be an oracle to foresee this unfortunate chain of events, which is marching inexorably, it seems, towards a greater confrontation, perhaps even World War III. At the same time, as you've suggested, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, there's so much Russophobia in the air right now. I mean, I made an arch comment a moment or two ago towards this BDS movement, which has taken flight with regard to Russia. I mean, you have people tossing out their principles left and right. I mean, Switzerland, supposedly a neutral country, no longer a neutral country. This is becoming quite dangerous. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I really don't have a clear answer, as my stumbling thus far tends to suggest. But I will say this much, that I don't think that people on the left need to be contributing to the Russophobia. People on the left do not need to be contributing to the demonizing of one individual. We should be accustomed to this by now. Don't people recall Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Slobodan Milosevic? That's usually the approach. You personalize it, and you give the gullible in this country, of which there are far too many, this villain from a Hollywood movie to focus on. So we really need to avoid that. But I think that the emphasis, as Katrina van der Wevel of The Nation has put it, should be on de-escalation and negotiation. And already, as noted, with regard to the latter, we've had President Ramaphosa of South Africa step forward, the Turks have stepped forward. There are a number of possible mediators. The Chinese have offered their good offices, although I think that Washington will veto that.
Don't forget the Israelis.
Oh, yes. The Prime Minister has been spending quality time in Moscow of late and chatting interminably on the phone with President
Naftali Bennett, world statesman. Yeah.
Right. So I think it's just a matter of emphasis, that our emphasis, we should keep our eye on the ball, which should be movements towards peace. That's our goal. We're not warmongers. There are enough warmongers already. They don't need us to join that crew. And that's about all I can say.
Thank you. Cole, I don't know if you had a question or if you're ready to lead us in the action. You or Mary Ellen?
Yeah, why don't we go to the action? It looks like Walden Bello is not able to join us tonight. And
That's too bad.
Apology for the miscommunication or whatever circumstance caused that. We haven't been able to, he said he would be here, but he didn't make contact. But anyway, let's go to the action because the push for a no-fly zone in Congress is rising. And with Zelensky's speech, we're very concerned. Mary Ellen, can you take over and explain this action?
Sure. And one more time, thanks so much to Professor Horne. It has been a real pleasure to have your wisdom tonight. So yes, we have, since this is our moment as a peace community, this is an historically important task that we have ahead of us. We have an easy tool that we can, we'll have for you in the chat. Cole, are you going to paste that in? I have a link handy. I'm not sure it's the right one.
By the way, just to let you know that Walden just did come in. So after we take the action, we can hear from Walden.
This is awesome. Let's hear from Walden.
No, I think we should do the action.
With the action.
Then we'll go to Walden.
I think with it. Okay. So the action is we have this tool, and in the chat you'll see a link where you'll be able to tell Congress, your members of Congress, President Biden, Secretaries Blinken and Austin, as well as the Vice President Harris, to reject the no-fly zone. And again, this is on the eve of President Zelensky speaking to Congress. He is expected to ask the US to establish a no-fly zone in Ukraine, which we have been duly made aware that could be really disastrous. And unfortunately, 3/4 of all Americans now approve of a no-fly zone because they think of it as some kind of invisible Star Wars force field, apparently. And apparently some members of Congress think this as well. So there is no military solution. If you fill out the form, it will send that message to Congress and the rest that I've mentioned, that urgent diplomacy is the only way to solve this, that a solution would incorporate an immediately ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops, an agreement that NATO will not expand further, and an establishment of Ukraine as a neutral country. There's a second ask as well, which is in addition to opposing a no-fly zone, we're also asking that the US not allow Poland, which is a member of NATO, to transfer fighter jets to Ukraine, because in that case, the US would replenish those jets with US F-15s. So again, another dangerous avenue to spiral things out of control. So I hope that you'll all take advantage of this tool and email Congress and the president and the administration in general to reject the no-fly zone.
All right, so we will do that.
And I will just add that we have 479 participants on the call, and we would like to see 479 people complete the action in the next few minutes, please.
Yes,
Cole can check, right?
Yes, we will. We will.
And I am going to check. Yes.
And I would also suggest that people call their member of Congress in Washington tomorrow and ask them to speak out, to issue a statement to their constituents rejecting this no-fly zone.
Great. So we should get on to introduce Walden. Who is doing that, Marcy?
Okay, we'll get there in just a minute. Maybe give people a few minutes to finish.
I think they can do it while we talk.
Yeah, I was actually supposed to do that. So let me go ahead.
Okay.
Welcome, Walden Bello. He is a professor of sociology and public administration at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and he's executive director of regional policy think tank focused on the global South. He's an international adjunct professor at Binghamton University in New York as well. He's the founder and chairperson of the left-wing alliance Laban Masa, which means fight of the masses in Philippine, and is a former member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines and a current candidate for vice president of the Philippines. Walden Bello.
So while Walden unmutes himself, I just want to say, Gerald, you're one of the most brilliant people I know, and thank you so much for that amazing talk and answering questions. And Walden is also one of the most brilliant people I know. So we are so delighted that you were able to join us, Walden. And just to put you up to date, we have had a wonderful talk by Gerald, and he answered a number of questions. But we would love to know your perspective because you are in the Global South. You know well the Global South, and so your perspective might be a little different, and we're delighted you were able to join us. Are you unmuted, Walden? Don't go.
more than meeting
I don't know if he can hear us. Walden.
You may have unmuted the wrong microphone.
Yes, you unmuted me, I think.
And me too, yeah.
Walden?
Walden, can you hear us?
Okay, there we go.
Yay.
Walden,
can you hear
welcome.
us?
Hello.
Yes.
And I've actually seen him become a man. And, when I started looking at the first 48 stories where these people will kill someone and they go to
Somebody is
jail.
unmuted. Who is that speaking?
Zoom says he's connecting to audio, so Zoom isn't linking up his audio feed yet.
Didn't say anything.
Well, Marcy, what do you suggest we do?
Well,
Let's give him a minute.
give him a minute, and then
Yeah,
if
he's trying.
he's trying
Yeah. Kind of hearing squeaks. It is exciting. We've had over 500 people on this call.
Yeah.
And just as he gets ready, I want to say we are part of a global movement called Peace in Ukraine. And we will be setting up a global webinar again very soon. And we'll let you all know about that.
And we also have Code Pink Radio, which Code Pink Congress produces once a month, or our campaign produce one. And please ask your radio station, your local radio station, be it a college station or a non-commercial station, to air Code Pink Radio. And also Shay, thank you, Shay, for navigating the tech tonight, can post in the chat here a link to join our Google group so you get our latest blasts. And perhaps you would like to be a Code Pink Congress liaison or point person for your Congress member. We would love that. Walden, Bello, can you see us? Can you hear us? Yes, please unmute.
I think he's been trying to do that.
There he goes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yay!
Yes. Woohoo!
Right. I'm terribly sorry. I'm right here in the boondocks on the campaign trail. So the thing is spotty. The internet connection is spotty here. But while it's still okay, then I'll be with you.
Yes, please tell us your thoughts about how the Ukraine crisis will impact global politics.
Oh, okay. So I assume we've begun.
Yes.
Yes, we've had almost an hour.
We talked
Oh my
with Gerald. We were talking with Gerald Horne for the last hour. Yeah.
Yes, I think we've got time problem because I expected this at 9 a.m. our time.
Time zone mix up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the international implications. I'll just be very quick around this. I think that while the global South, most countries have signed on to the General Assembly resolution to
Walden, you might turn off your video.
Condemned the bill of hesitation about being. Turn off video.
Yeah, Walden, maybe, yeah, turn off the video. It'll be easier.
Okay. Well, there has been a great deal of hesitation about being more actively involved on the U.S. side. And I think that is the sort of a strong hesitation that's being registered by many countries in the global South. I think the hesitation for this stems on the one hand, but definitely people don't agree with the invasion because of the violence, the violation of national sovereignty. But the other thing is a very, very strong feeling, that the U.S. And NATO, in fact, provoked this with NATO's push ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, ever since the early 1990s, to push Ukraine and the surrounding countries bordering the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union or Russia, into NATO. So this was definitely one of the major initiatives of the Clinton administration. So I don't think that this view is something that is shared by the global South alone. I think that the recent article of Professor Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, who is one of the more conservative, political realist schools of international analysis, blames NATO and the US squarely for having triggered this invasion by the constant press to bring in NATO into Ukraine into NATO, as well as the coordination or the work that has been done by the Central Intelligence Agency and US officials with far right-wing groups to install a pro-NATO and pro-Western regime. So that's one aspect that I think needs to be registered from the very beginning. The second thing is that a lot of people have, been appalled by the way, that while Ukrainians, white Ukrainians are being admitted and welcomed into particular Africans are being barred, or they are subjected to very discriminatory treatment by Polish and other authorities. And just this sense that racism is at work even during wartime, and that this sort of reflects the kind of racist underpinnings of both NATO and the European Union. The third thing, of course, is the utter hypocrisy of condemning the Soviet, the Russian invasion, and at the same time having not condemned incursions and the violation of the rights of national sovereignty, of people's rights, especially when it comes to Palestine, on the part of the US, the Biden administration. So these double standards that the Palestinians have underlined is something that is something that resonates with the global South. And this is why I think there's a great deal of hesitation. People don't want to be pulled into the US side here, because what they see is this is really the traditional geopolitics and racist politics and double standards of the West that is at work here. Now, coming to this part of the world, and let me just let me just underline a few points. There have been commentaries initially that said that, wow, doesn't this sort of thing, in fact, encourage China to do something about Taiwan? That's to put it crudely. But nevertheless, I think that there has been this, in the ongoing demonization of China. The Ukraine invasion has had a spin-off in terms of conservative U.S. Pentagon analysis, that Taiwan might be next. Let me just say a few points with respect to this. One is that the situation in the Ukraine and Russia, and NATO, and Taiwan and the United States is very different. There is no secure NATO. It's not yet a member of NATO, but there is a strong security treaty that binds Taiwan to the United States. So that's the first thing that we really need to know. The second thing is that the US has a massive naval presence in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits. The Seventh Fleet is there all the time. And we're talking about the South China Sea is not really, dominated by China. It's an American lake. Those of us who have been doing military analysis of the Western Pacific for a long number of years, just see that it's silly to talk about China controlling the South China Sea, or what we call in the Philippines, the West Philippine Sea. Under the surface, you do have dozens of US attack submarines, as well as nuclear ICBM submarines. On the surface, you have aircraft carriers and the whole host of contingents of surface ships, that accompany the Seventh Fleet. Okay, and then on the air, you have complete U.S. dominance, naval air dominance of the air. So China would be crazy, to attempt any kind of move in the context of, the tremendous military dominance of the United States, which is, of course, supported by bases in Japan, in South Korea, and the Philippines. China is practically just surrounded by, this U.S. military garrison state in the Western Pacific. The other thing that I think we really need to understand is China is not about to forsake its diplomatic gains or the gains of its economic diplomacy, which has won it friends around the world and in the global South, by committing a kind of a reckless action in the area. So that's the furthest thing that China would be interested in. What we're worried about here, and I believe what I worry about here is that, in fact, it is the U.S. that might stoke tensions in this area to make up for its humiliating exit from Afghanistan and the loss of credibility even to its Western allies in Europe, that accompanied this. So there is this worry, that geopolitically, what is really worrisome here is, because of its military dominance, is that the US would find ways of raising military tensions in this area. Now, I worry about that because of several things. One is that with respect to China, it's quite clear that China has become the center of global capitalist accumulation. It accounts for 28% of GDP growth, compared to the US is only half that. So that's fairly clear. the second thing that I think we need to pay attention to is that the only place where the US really continues to maintain undisputed superiority is in the military. And the US spends 3 times more than China in terms of its budget. And definitely, the quality of the US forces, including its naval forces, is so far above, that of China. And really, China is not really competing at this point in time. So, and finally, the one thing that we must really see here is, that the U.S. is in the midst of what I've called an informal civil war, and the way that the right wing of the Democratic managed the matter to take away, or to counter the rise of the far right in the United States has been to engage in strong pro-imperialist military talk. And traditionally, of course, the Democratic Party, has used a strong kind of pro-imperialist stand in order to be able to influence domestic politics. So Biden, I think, is employing traditional, kind of democratic tactics of using foreign policy to try to influence the direction of domestic politics. So these are the considerations that I would really bring up, both international as well as in terms of U.S. domestic politics, when we assess the way that the U.S. and the West, has behaved with respect to the Ukraine crisis. So let me just finalize my point here that it is an invasion that definitely must be condemned. We must push for the negotiations so that we can have peace immediately in the area. But we must also pinpoint very strongly the responsibility of NATO and the United States for provoking this crisis. And if there's anything that we need to worry about in other parts of the world, it's the way that to make up for many of its problems in the last few years, including the exit from Afghanistan, the U.S. might try to stoke problems elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walden Bello. Great to hear from you. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. Yeah, I've often thought, ever since Russia said, several days ago, look, the bombs will stop immediately if Ukraine declares neutrality, will not join NATO, enshrines that into its constitution, if Russia takes full control of Crimea, which basically it has, and that we have independence for those eastern regions of Ukraine. So my thinking is, why is this still underway? Why can't we agree to this, given that today, Zelensky said Ukraine will remain neutral, and NATO has made it clear they don't want to get into a direct confrontation with Russia. So I'm not clear on what's holding it up, and I think it's disgraceful that Biden has not been part of this process in urging a diplomatic solution. I'd like to ask you a question. Since you're running for vice president of the Philippines, Walden Bello, what has been the response to your platform? It sounds like you have an anti-imperialist platform. How's that going on the campaign trail? And what has the coverage been like of the Ukraine crisis in the Philippines? So that's a two-part question.
Okay, the focus of the coverage of the Ukraine crisis in the Philippines has been our workers in the Ukraine. There are not many, but we have something like around 300 Filipino workers in the Ukraine, and the focus has been to try to secure their their safety, and concerned that they not be discriminated against if they look for jobs in Moldova, in Poland, and any of the other surrounding countries. The second thing is the Philippine government has condemned invasion, but at the same time, it has been, exhibiting this ambiguity with respect to the United States. The last statement that has been made by our president, that the U.S. military facilities in the Philippines would be open to supporting any U.S. action related to the Ukraine, has been taken by many of us to be a really ghastly move. This just shows that despite his previous anti-American rhetoric in the first 2 or 3 years, Duterte has now shifted, into a wholesale embrace of the United States. And as you know, when he says that U.S. military facilities in the Philippines would be open to, to supporting something the U.S. Makes with respect related to the Ukraine. We have about 5 U.S. military bases here, which are nominal Philippine bases. So the people know that we kicked out the 2 big U.S. bases back in 1992, 1991, 1992, Clark and Subic. But what people don't know is that owing to developments over the last 7 years, the U.S. now has 5 military bases in the Philippines that are really part of the West Pacific garrison of the United States. So this is very worrisome, that, after flirting with either a pro-US stand or a neutral stand over the last few years, in the last 2 years, the Philippine president has again brought the Philippines back into full alliance with the United States, and that's extremely worrisome, for us. So, but I think most people in the Philippines, their realization is that the national interests of the Philippines are not involved in the Ukraine crisis, so that I do not think that what Duterte has done, which is to open up U.S. military facilities to, that he said that the U.S. can just use them any way it wants with respect to the Ukraine. I don't think that's a popular move at this point in time. So we are the only force running as a tandem. Caliotti de Guzman and I, we're both running on a socialist platform and a solid anti-imperialist platform. This is something very new. Now, independently is running, for office and no longer being part of what we call elite-led.
Well, then we lost you. I'm sorry.
And we're making a lot of headway, and
Walden, we can't really hear you.
People. Okay,
but we heard the gist of your
back.
message.
He's back.
Lamar, I was big. No.
Well,
okay.
I wish you the best of luck on the campaign trail, Walden. Thank you for taking that message to the people, an anti-imperialist message.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes, we're going to wrap it up. So maybe your final thoughts.
Okay. Thank you to everyone. I am a great supporter of Code Pink, of Medea Benjamin, and all of you nice people there fighting to get the real views around the Ukraine. And you can be definite that we're with you all the way. And we also appreciate the support of our friends in the United States. It's an uphill struggle.
Yes, it is an
here,
uphill struggle.
just like
Agree
there.
with you.
But we're sort of, if we don't win, although we hope we will win this time, at least we're planting the seeds for a future struggles for socialism here in the Philippines.
Well, good luck to you, Vice Presidential candidate in the Philippines, Walden Bello. So glad you and Dr. Horne could join us. Yes. And in my most hopeful moments, I think, gee, you know, we are coming so close to a nuclear confrontation, to nuclear annihilation, that maybe this will be a wake-up call about our bellicosity and the danger of this pivot to Asia. You know, once people realize what they are pushing. So thank you for joining us. Perhaps we can all unmute and thank Dr. Horne and Walden Bello for joining us on Code Pink.